the recording. Thank you, Dawn.
Okay, well, thanks for the invitation. I much appreciate it, and welcome to everyone here. And I hope I can give you a clear story about mobbing. I think the first thing I'll do is to see if I can share the screen and go to my PowerPoint and start it and get rid of the picture so that I can see the whole slides. So we'll just get started. I much appreciate the invitation. So this is a story about mobbing behavior in birds, and unmute. Okay. Can you unmute yourself and make sure I'm being heard now? My computer said I wasn't.
You are now being heard. Sorry, Dawn.
Yeah. Okay. I had unmuted it once, but I guess it had to happen again. So I'll just repeat that I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak, and I hope I can tell you some interesting things about mobbing behavior in birds. And we're still, sorry, there's little glitches here happening. Okay, so I don't quite know what's going on there. As Anne mentioned, I have an academic background in animal behavior, but I've never directly studied mobbing behavior. And as a few people noticed, I hadn't really worked on birds very much either. So this is a talk that's come largely from pulling the literature together, but in the context of my understanding of behavior. But it's important to note, unlike many speakers we've had in the Natural History Society, I didn't collect any of the data or take any of the photos here. And an interesting thing about this aspect is not only that I've learned a lot in developing the talk, but I've learned a lot about what's not known, and birders who are paying attention to what birds are doing can actually contribute quite a bit to some of these unknown areas. And I'll try to bring that up as we go along. So I'd like to start just by reminding you about observations of mobbing that you may have seen in the local area. So I'm talking about southern Vancouver Island, but I realize many people are from other places, and you'll see that that many of the same patterns are there. But here on Vancouver Island, it's not rare to see an eagle flying over, being chased by one or more glaucous-winged gulls, uttering quite short, harsh cries that I don't have any audio for those. It doesn't seem to have been recorded independently, but I feel that I can recognize when the gulls are signaling an eagle's presence and look around for the eagle and often find it. But another situation that many people have seen would be northwestern crows, or maybe they're American crows on the island now, and American crows in most of the, except for the coastal area, much of the rest of the continent. Frequently, you see them gathered, or not frequently, but from time to time, when you're lucky, you see them gathered around perhaps a perched great horned owl, as in this photo, or other situations, and giving a very raucous call. These are American crows. So I think that's enough. I think many of you probably have heard that call before, as they just gather around in a large group. And if you get there early on in the process, you'll see crows coming perhaps from many different directions, joining the group in the tree around the owls. We also around here see crows mobbing ravens from time to time with a vigorous pursuit when they're flying or surrounding them in a tree. American robins also behave similarly, although they don't form the large groups. Sometimes if you hear one or two robins calling, you can find a raptor, an owl, or a hawk in that same area. So here's the mobbing call of a couple of robins. So that can go on really for some time, for many minutes. I didn't want it to go on for that many minutes. There we go. So another situation which some of us have been lucky enough to see is a flock of chickadees. Here on the island, it would be chestnut-backed chickadees. On the mainland, it would be most likely to be black-capped chickadees. And a difference, quite a striking difference from the ones that I've mentioned already, is that the chickadees may be members of a larger group of mixed species that gather around a perched predator. And this is a recording that Anne made. I think it was in her yard with chestnut-backed chickadees and other species mobbing a barred owl. And let me just see if I can get. I think you'll.
Don,
Yes.
could you check to see if you have, you said use computer audio with your sharing? Because I think we're just hearing it through your speakers.
Okay. You are screen sharing. Select a speaker, same as system or built-in output internal speakers.
No, it's not there. You might have to stop share and then restart the share, but make sure you have the use computer audio checked when you
Stop.
Okay.
Okay.
And now when you go to share again, on the bottom of your share screen, it says use computer audio.
Share sound, that one?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think you get better
You
quality.
share your audio, install the Zoom audio device. I don't think we're about to go there, are
Okay,
we?
no, we're not.
No, they want a password for.
It should have been simpler than that. It should have just said use computer audio. No? If you don't see that, then just continue. I think that we're picking it up from your speakers though, rather than through your computer.
I think we've lost them.
Do we lose him? He'll be back. There are some issues on occasion with the technology. Come back, Dawn.
He was having some connectivity issues when we practiced on Monday, so.
Oh, well, we're waiting for Dawn to return. No, we'll just wait. I think he should be back here quickly. I hope. I think he's back. Now I just have to find him so I can make him a co-host again. He is back. We will resume shortly.
All right, there. Now I'm unmuted again the next time.
Yes.
So I don't know why the system turfed me out of that completely, but I'm sorry. So how far? So you weren't able to hear any of the audio of the chickadees and things?
We could, but it was not very good. And so that was what made me think that you didn't have use computer audio check.
Okay. I think probably rather than try to go back with the audio, it's not such a critical part. I'll probably just continue on. So I'll go back to share screen and go on with the PowerPoint. Hopefully people didn't miss too much. So I'm sorry about all that. Oh, geez. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. For some reason, when I try to get the sound in, it just trips me out of the meeting. So I'm clicking on something that says back to meeting, and it's not going back to the meeting.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I go to can you see that PowerPoint now?
Yes, we can.
Now it's back.
Okay. Whoops. All right.
There we go.
Okay. Okay, so I think we were talking about the mixed species flocks of chickadees that we see here and on the mainland. It's a very common situation in mobbing, widespread in North America, and similarly with the titmice in Europe. Okay, an interesting thing about these mixed species groups is just how many species they attract. This is a study, this is based on a study that was done in Wisconsin. They played back chickadee mobbing calls at 18 different locations of abandoned chickadee nests. And this is a list of the bird species that they attracted with those mobbing calls just in those 18 playbacks. So a huge range from finches and warblers, mimic thrushes, many thrushes, blackbirds, and so on. Quite woodpeckers, just a huge range of species. So with that brief introduction and unfortunate pauses in between, mobbing has some common features. Typically, mobbers are smaller than the target species. Usually, it's quite surprising. It's a surprising thing to many observers that they're actually approaching a predator, since you often expect prey to flee a predator. If the predator is moving, the mobbers will follow it. If it's perched, they'll often gather around it. And they're making themselves quite apparent, both auditorily and visually. They have distinctive loud calling. They have conspicuous movements, many perch changes. There are quite specific wing and tail movements that they exercise as well. Furthermore, it's often not in response to a direct attack. It's proactive in the sense that an owl may be just sitting there, or a hawk may be perched, not actually hunting or actively hunting, and the mobbing starts. And another common feature is that the calling of the first birds that start often attracts other individuals, either of the same species, as we've often seen in crows, or in other species, as we can see in chickadees. But there's quite a bit of variation in mobbing too. It's observed in many species, but there are species also that never mob. Some species mob typically in a group of members of the same species, and others in mixed species. Sometimes the victim is mainly stationary, other times moving. The mobbing group may be just one or two individuals, or it could be large, numbering tens or even more. Some species mob only in the breeding season, so it blends into nest defense against both predators of eggs and nestlings, but also nest parasites such as cuckoos and cowbirds that might be laying eggs in the nest. But other species mob at any time of year, and often when we see the chickadees mobbing, for example, it's in the winter season. The behavior used in mobbing can be quite variable as well. Sometimes there's strong physical contact, and other times not. Some species stay well back from a predator, others get quite close and even make physical contact. And in situations where individuals happen to be banded and we can recognize the different individuals, we see that not all individuals mob in the same way. Some call much more than others, some get much closer than others. And the target species can be also quite variable. Some are potential predators on the adults, so they're actually directly facing their predators. Others may be predators of eggs or nestlings, but not necessarily of a high risk to the adults. As I mentioned, some could be nest parasites, and we also see mobbing of non-threatening species. So birds mobbing kingfishers or ospreys that might not be any threat at all. And I wanted to mention one study in the context of talking about the seasonal patterns of mobbing. This is a study of the patterns in crows mobbing ravens in North America. And one reason that I want to do it is it shows how eBird's surveys can be actually useful in research and answering questions. So in this case, one of the researchers was associated with the eBird group in Cornell, and the other one had an interesting question about why crows were mobbing ravens. And what they did was they surveyed all the eBird records that had crows or ravens and looked for all those that had comments. And they had, as you can see here, 308,000 of those records. And then they took the number of those records that mentioned something about aggression, dive bombing, mobbing, attacking, and words like that. And with a clear indication of which one was the aggressor and which was the target of the attack. And they came up with about 2,000 of those records. And then they sorted them out by month. And what you can see here is a graph of the pattern. So it's what proportion of the checklist that had comments indicated that crows were attacking ravens in each month. And what you can see is that there's a very strong peak in the breeding season, which would suggest that the crows are engaged in nest defense against ravens, which would be a potential egg and nestling predator, but that the mobbing continues throughout the year, but with an interesting dip in the late summer and then an increase through the winter. And they had a number of hypotheses about that. But part of the reason for mentioning it was just to encourage you to consider when you make an observation, not just to record the crows, but if they're mobbing an owl or something, it's worth putting a mention of that, because it's possible that the data could contribute to a larger analysis later on. So now I'm just going to give an overview of some of the groups of birds in which mobbing has been observed, just to kind of remind you and give you an overview. And I think there'll be a chance in the question period for those that have seen other groups mobbing to share that with me and with the audience as well. So the crow family is well known for mobbing, although even though ravens can be mobbed, they can also, they are also mobbers of other predators, crows, and then many of the jays are very active mobbing species. The gull and tern family are very active mobbers, almost always on their nesting colonies, they're mobbers. But as we've mentioned, we can see outside of the breeding season, we can see gulls attacking eagles, for example, farther from breeding sites. And although I don't recall seeing any plovers doing any mobbing in this area, the northern lapwing in the plover family in Europe is a very active mobber, and there are quite a number of studies of mobbing by lapwings. The thrush family is active mobbers. We've talked about robins. In Europe, the fieldfare is known for mobbing, and it's a semi-colonial nesting species, and they engage in group mobbing attacks on nest predators such as ravens. I put a little mention down here. BBC Earth has a Attenborough section on mobbing by fieldfares, and they emphasize one of the striking components of that mobbing behavior, in which the birds apparently deliberately defecate on the target of their mobbing. And this sequence, I'll put it into the chat later, although Anne may have to remind me to do that. I have a link there so that you can see it. It's really quite striking. But if you just searched BBC and fieldfares, you would find it. The New World blackbirds are also very active mobbers. Many of you may have, while out birding in the breeding season, been attacked by red-winged blackbirds. And then the mimic thrushes, and in this example, it's a mockingbird, but others of the mimic thrushes are also active mobbers. The tyrant flycatchers here can be mobbers. In this case, it's a eastern kingbird mobbing an osprey, and the old world flycatchers as well. And I'll come back to an example of the pied flycatcher later on. The chickadee faraday, or the titmice in Europe, are also active, very active mobbers. And so we've also referred to those already. Who haven't seen it might be quite surprised that hummingbirds are active mobbers. I've seen it only a couple of times, but it's quite striking when you see it, and others have also reported this. And many of the swallows also can be active in mobbing. And even some hawks can be active in mobbing. So the Western Marsh Harrier in Europe is another colonially nesting species, and they're quite well known for mobbing other potential predators. And then those of you that have had the good fortune to visit the tropics in various places may have seen mobbing there in the families that we're not very familiar with here, like fulvetas in Southeast Asia or ant shrikes in Panama. And in Australia, there are a number of species that are active mobbers, and the fairy wren, the superb fairy wren, is one of those. And it's worth reminding you that birds don't just mob other birds, they also mob mammals and snakes. So here's the best picture I could find available of a tern that's attacking an Arctic fox, presumably relatively near to a nesting site. And then Florida scrub jays have been quite well studied for their mobbing of snakes, which aren't predators on the adults, but are predators on eggs and nestlings. And with small snakes, they actually sometimes can kill them. And with larger ones can get them to leave the nesting area. So we know there are quite a few reports of species that mob. We have an idea of the diversity, but there's no record that I know of which species have never been reported mobbing, or even whether all the mobbing species have been reported. And it might be quite interesting to compile a list of the species that mob in the circumstances, because that might give some overviews into the function or the variety of functions of mobbing. So when you're out birding and you're with a mixed group and someone sees a gull chasing an eagle, one of the first questions they say, well, isn't that dangerous? Why would they be doing something like that? And so some have argued that mobbers might be at relatively low risk. Being smaller than the targets of their mobbing, they have greater maneuverability. They know the predator's location, and that's really a good deal of the battle in keeping safe, is to keep an eye on the predator. It's not the case with the gull and the eagle, but with many forest birds, they actually can use cover quite effectively while they're mobbing a predator. They can approach from behind, and also as a group gathers, there's a lower risk, because the larger the group, the smaller the risk of any one individual. But on the other hand, despite all those arguments, there is actually some evidence of danger. So there's Denson in '79 reported a single observation of a great horned owl that was being mobbed by crows, and it sat there and it sat there, and the crows mobbed, and they got closer and closer, and suddenly the owl just reached out with one talon, grabbed a crow that had come too close on the branch, and just held it against the branch for half a minute, and then flew off with it, with the crows all still mobbing and still following, but presumably that one crow didn't survive. And there's at least one report also of a Cooper's hawk that was being mobbed by redwings, and as the redwing got close, the Cooper's hawk just rolled over and grabbed the redwing with both talons from beneath, and then completed the roll and went off with the redwing in its talons. So in 1990, an author summarized all these sort of small anecdotes to come up with some picture. He only came up with about 30 cases, which, considering all the observations people have made, doesn't seem like much, but it shows that mobbing can be risky in some situations. So there are a few cases of actual mortality of mobbers, but it could be that mobbing is actually very dangerous, but that the mobbers are so effective at reducing the risk that it doesn't actually show up in direct mortality. And in that case, it would be the behavior of the birds that would actually show whether there is a risk that they perceive and are taking measures for. And that provides some evidence as well. So Curio and Regelman did a study of great tits, so a European chickadee equivalent, although bigger, mobbing the Eurasian pygmy owl, which was presented in the forest in a cage. And what they found was that a number of aspects of the behavior of the mobbers indicated that the owl, which is actually a predator on small passerine birds, was being approached as a dangerous situation. They had a kind of a skulky approach, that is using cover and going slowly, changing position quite frequently so that their approach path was indirect and couldn't be easily predicted, frequent stops that apparently checking out the situation, and they would approach the owl more closely from behind than in front. And another study that also indicates that birds, when they're mobbing, recognize that they are potentially at some risk. So this study was done on a banded population of Siberian jays, which are like our Canada jays, and looked at their behavior in relation to sparrowhawks, and so this is Europe, and Ural owl models. So they had taxidermy mounts that were stuffed and were placed. And they had the birds coming to a variety of different feeding stations. And so the birds would come and feed, and then they'd put this model in there and look at what their reaction was. And they already knew that the sparrowhawks were much more dangerous than the owls. And they knew that because of where they found the bands of birds that had been predated. And so what they found was, if we look at the top graph here, the hawks were mobbed for a much longer period of time on average than the owls were. But the behavior also differed. So the jays would swoop down sometimes on the owls. That is, if any of you perhaps have been mobbed, sort of attacked from behind, hit in the head, that kind of a swoop only happened with owls and not with hawks. And on the other, another indicator of the difference in danger was that occasionally the birds would stop mobbing, and individuals would go to the feeder for a quick bite and then go back and return to mobbing. And feeder visits only occurred in the situation with the owl, not with the hawk. So this again suggests that the birds are behaving in such a way that it is a risky situation, and they're changing their behavior in proportion to the risk. But there's another really interesting, almost an anecdote, little more than an anecdote, that I found about the dangers of mobbing. And that is a mobbing target that actually uses mobbing to lure lure its prey. So this is a falcon, a slaty-backed forest falcon that was studied in Panama. And Neil Smith observed it giving a call that was clearly attracting many small bird species. The mobbers gave a lot of alarm calls as they surrounded the forest falcon, but they remained generally very well hidden behind leaves and branches. And after some time, the falcon moved. It hopped down to the ground, hopped along, moved along to another tree, and then suddenly attacked and caught a tanager. And what Neil Smith realized afterwards was that the prey were so well hidden that the hawk couldn't see them. And by changing position, he forced the change in position of the mobbers, and in that movement, it let them reveal their location. And so he only saw this one situation clearly. He saw another one where he heard the calls, and then the hawk came out of the bushes, flew across a road with a bird in its talons. But he did manage to record the calls. And when he played those back, he found that, again, they attracted many species. So the target is actually attracting mobbing species. And one interesting additional observation he made was that the local species stayed very well hidden when he was playing his recordings back. but North American winter migrants that were in Panama during North American winter were nowhere near as wary and were much more obvious. So there's another sort of potential danger from mobbing in that it might actually be possibly misused, if you want to say it that way, from the prey's point of view by the predator. But it's probably worth remembering that in ecology, we can have the possibility of other costs, not just mortality. And so one of those is that mobbing may attract nest predators who recognize that mobbing may indicate the presence of a nest. So there's one study on the UBC campus of crows that showed clearly that when mobbing calls of American robins were played back, crows were attracted to that location. So even though mobbing is used to potentially attack predators, they may be also attracted and gain an advantage. Another study was done in Europe, and it was done on pied flycatchers that use nest boxes. It's not a very good picture of the flycatcher here, but there's a nest box. And in this species, martins prey on the eggs and nestlings in the nest box. They can get into the nest box and attack those. So what the researchers did was put playback systems on the roof of nest boxes that weren't being used at the time. And inside they made a little artificial nest with a quail egg inside. And during the daytime, they played back mobbing calls of pied flycatchers, not very long. As I recall, it was only like 5 minutes. And the control had just a blank tape. And subsequently, over the following night, so martins are nocturnal, there was a much higher predation rate on the quail eggs in the nest boxes where the mobbing call had been played than where it wasn't. So there's another indication of a possible cost to eggs and nestling. And then it's important to remember that mobbing also takes time and energy. So you look at a kingbird chasing an osprey, that's going to take a great deal of energy. Or if you look at how long the crows hang around with an owl in a tree, you realize that, isn't there something else important that they could be doing, feeding or sheltering or something like that? So there's time and energy costs as well. So so what we know is that mobbing is dangerous and it has other costs at least some of the time, but we really don't have any idea of just how costly it is, and especially if you add up these different kinds of costs. And we really don't know how frequently mobbers could be killed and what are the situations that are of higher and lower risk. And this is where it's so hard to see one of those things that each person's anecdotal observation can eventually add up to an understanding of a broader pattern. So when a behavioral ecologist starts to see a behavior that looks very costly, they begin to think about, well, what could the benefits be that could outweigh these potentially high costs? And the one that comes up most often for mobbing it's called the move on hypothesis. And the idea is that when predators are mobbed, they should leave the area, but it wouldn't do much good if they only left the area briefly. So they should also not return to that area or not for some substantial time. And the reasons why they might leave is because hunting would be very difficult in a situation. So when a bird is being mobbed, all the other birds in the area know where the predator is. And once the predator is seen, it's much more difficult for the predator to have a successful hunt. And another aspect from the point of view of the target of the mobbing is that even though the predators are much larger, still being attacked from behind and being pecked and so on is potentially risky. And so that avoidance requires some time and energy as well. So it just may not be a very comfortable situation. And mobbing might give this benefit from the predator moving on. It could protect the mobbed individuals or the mobbing individuals if that's their normal home range. Could be protecting their dependent young or their eggs. It could be protecting neighbors or especially relatives such as recently fledged young. But the data that test whether mobbing actually gets predators to move on turn out to be very limited. There were really very few cases that I was able to find. One of the neatest was a study of European kestrels, which are quite a bit like the American kestrels here. This was a study done in broad open fenlands in England. And as with our American kestrel, the European kestrel has two ways of hunting. It can either perch on a post or a tree and look around and then attack a prey if it sees it on the ground or flying. Or it can do wind hovering, where it hovers in place by rapidly beating its wings and staying in a position, much like if you haven't seen a kestrel do that, you may have seen a kingfisher do similar behavior. So this study was done in fenlands where the researchers had a good knowledge of all the landmarks and could estimate the movements of the kestrels quite easily and from quite a distance. So for the, let's see, where's my cursor here? So when they looked at the kestrels that were hunting from perches, they found that when they were not being mobbed, they moved something like, say, 150 meters or so, a little bit less, between perches for each sort of hunting move. But when they were being mobbed, they went all the way up to about 400 meters. So a big increase in the distance that they moved. So they were moving on in this case. And for the wind hovering kestrels, when they weren't being mobbed, their distances were under 100 meters. So obviously they weren't limited by the availability of perches. And so that's quite a small distance. And proportionally, it was much higher. It was over half a kilometer between wind hovering positions when they were mobbed. So this is an indication that it does actually have an effect. But there aren't many studies like that at all. And you can imagine how difficult it would be to actually set up that situation. And this is observational. To actually check it with an experiment would be even harder. Now, another line of evidence, kind of indirect, but still quite interesting and worth considering, is a study that looked for whether there were stress reactions to mobbing in hawks and owls. So they went to a rehab center that had a variety of hawks and owls. They presented them with mobbing calls from crows, blue jays, black-capped chickadees, and blue-headed vireos. And as a control, so that they weren't just looking at a response to to noise out of a speaker, they used the black-capped chickadee song, the Phoebe song. And what they found was that the hawks and owls responded in ways that they interpreted as indicating stress. So orientation to the speaker, erecting their feathers, spreading their wings, changing perches more often. And so those responses were stronger to the mobbing calls than to the chickadee song. And the responses were stronger to the larger mobbers, crows and blue jays, than to smaller ones, chickadees and vireos. And interestingly, the response was stronger in raptors that had been brought to the center as adults rather than those that had been brought in as juveniles. So this suggested to them that having had previous experience of being mobbed added to the stress of hearing those mobbing calls. So I think it's worth thinking a little bit of empathy there. We don't want to be too anthropomorphic, but on the other hand, we can also think about what is it like to be mobbed. So many of you may have had the experience of being mobbed, perhaps crows in breeding season, or red-winged blackbirds, or perhaps raptors if you dared go near a raptor nest in the breeding season or something like that. And I've had those experiences myself, and it's a little distressing, but not so much. But my most empathetic experience of being mobbed was being mobbed by cattle. And so I used to, when I was a teenager, I used to fish along a stream, kind of in a lowland swamp, where people would put their dry cows and their heifers in to mature. And so these cattle, although they were dairy cattle, wouldn't see many people for the whole summer. So every once in a while, my dog had come trotting back to me, followed by a herd of these heifers. And then he'd sort of stand between my legs and I'd get surrounded by these cattle. And, you know, I worked on a dairy farm and I wasn't really afraid of cattle. But on the other hand, when you have a whole herd of them acting a little bit like wild animals and sort of snorting and hoofing, stomping their feet and so on, I said, oh yeah, so this is, yes, it can be intimidating. And so, and it turns out that that experience isn't unique. I've talked to a few other people who've had similar experiences, and the experience is so widespread in the UK that they actually put up signs where common use footpaths cross cattle pastures to warn people that the cattle may threaten them, warn them to try to keep away from the cattle if possible, and to keep their dogs on a leash so that presumably the cattle in my situation and others are actually mobbing the dog as kind of a wolf equivalent rather than, or a fox equivalent, rather than actually attacking the person. So they say, keep your dog on a leash so it doesn't provoke the cattle. But interestingly enough, if the cattle are actually approaching and threaten you, let the dog go. So the most serious injuries were by people who picked up their dog to protect it. And some of them, I think, were actually killed. And certainly there were some very serious injuries in that. So you think of bulls as being dangerous, but actually it's the cows that are more dangerous in this situation. So I'm a bit empathetic with what a predator might feel like in being mobbed. So what we know is that it's likely then that mobbing should reduce hunting success, that mob predators do sometimes move away from their mobbers, that mobbing is likely to be stressful for the predators. But what we don't know yet is just by how much the hunting success of the targets of the mobbing is reduced. We don't know if nocturnal predators like owls that move away during the day, whether they come back to the same area at night or whether they actually stay away from that area. We don't know whether day active predators like the hawks and so on might just circle back to the same area, or if somehow that's a negative enough experience to keep them away. But in a situation where the predators can get mobbed almost wherever they go, it's actually really interesting to consider how does that mobbing behavior affect the ecology of the predators in the first place if they actually have trouble getting free from mobbing. There's been some interesting little studies about where owls perch, doing experimental studies of putting taxidermy mounts of owls in various places, hidden and more exposed, and showing that the more exposed they are, the more likely they are to be mobbed. And even some studies in Northern Europe suggesting that the polymorphisms in color, gray versus red-brown, might be related to being more cryptic from hiding from mobbers. So it could have important effects on their ecology, but we don't know very much about that. So I'd like to now turn to another question, and that is, how do birds know which species to mob? So this question comes up when we see, you know, gulls mobbing an osprey that shouldn't be that much of a problem to them. But it's a broader issue because the predators and prey may not have the same, a prey population might not have the same predators in all areas of its habitat. So how do they know what species to mob? So one possibility is that they could have some kind of innate recognition of the predators and they just focus on those. Another possibility is that they can learn on their own which ones are dangerous by, say, which predators attack them. And the third possibility is that there could be some kind of a cultural transmission, that is learning from other individuals which ones are dangerous. And of course, those could be combined. So innate predator recognition isn't by any means impossible. For example, in some species, fledglings that have no previous experience can innately recognize their parents' alarm calls. And when the parents are giving alarm calls for different predators, they can respond appropriately. So in some species where the parents signal snakes versus ravens as predators, the newly hatched nestlings, well, not the newly hatched, but fledglings will leave the nest when the predator is a snake and hunker down deep inside the nest cavity when the predator is a crow. So it is possible to genetically program some kind of a recognition, although in this recognition, it's not of the predator, but of the parent alarm call. But much of the evidence for mobbing and other responses to predators suggests that learning is very important. So this is one study of learning by Marsh and his group at the University of Washington. So the top graph shows the number of mobbing events for given types of encounters. So in this first bar, for example, what they looked at was how many times crows were in the same area as ospreys. And in that case, the crows didn't mob most of the time. So it looks like 11 times they didn't, and once they did mob. But when crows were in the same area as bald eagles, most of the time they mobbed. That's the dark part of the bar. And the same with red-tailed hawks. So in this case, the two more dangerous predators were the ones that were mobbed more. But you can see these sample sizes. So 12 encounters of crows with ospreys, and only it looks like 9 and 8 with the other two predators. But you can imagine sending out your students to kind of look and say, sit here until you see both crows and ospreys in the same area where they could see each other, and then see what happens. So that could be a relatively slow process. So they tried to kind of speed up their sampling with stuffed taxidermic mounts of ospreys and red-tailed hawks. And so they got a similar result in situations where ospreys typically occurred. So let's see. Yeah, so where, I think I might have said that wrong. The mounts were of ospreys and hawks, and they presented them to crows. So where crows where ospreys typically occurred, the crows would mob the hawk and much less the osprey, although they still did mob the osprey some of the time. But in situations where ospreys didn't typically occur, so in denser forest and hilltops away from water and so on, the situation was very different. They mobbed the ospreys almost as much as they mobbed the hawk. And so what that suggests is that exposure to the ospreys somehow gets the birds to learn that this isn't a threat or isn't a species to be mobbed. So it suggests that it's an individual learning situation through the bird's own experience. And many of you may have heard about these clever experiments by Marsh on the University of Washington campus, where the initial observation was that after they entered crows' nests in order to band the young, the crows consistently mobbed them on the campus whenever they went through. So they followed this up by using a set of masks. And what they found was that the crows would learn which mask was associated with getting at their nests and handling the nestlings and so on. And they would consistently attack that, people wearing that mask as they walked across the campus, whereas people without masks or with different masks were not attacked. So it suggests that the birds individually learned who were the threats and followed those consistently. But there's some evidence also that birds can learn from other individuals which birds to mob. So was a very elegant experience by Eberhard Curio and some co-workers. It was published actually quite a while ago, but it still is just very neat. It's going to take me, it's kind of a complicated experiment, so I hope you'll bear with me and that I won't screw up as I just did a little bit with the other experiment about ospreys and hawks. So the species here that they focused on was the European blackbird. So it's in the same genus as our robin here. It's an active mobbing species that mobs hawks and owls. And so it's quite similar. So they were using wild caught blackbirds that were just held in captivity for the purposes of the experiment, so temporarily. So these birds presumably had natural experience of mobbing owls and seeing others mob them. And what they used as a stimulus to generate mobbing was a stuffed mount of a little owl, and what they used as the non-threatening species to see if they could actually get the birds to learn to attack that was a herbivorous bird. So this is an Australian friar bird, which is in the honeyeater group. So it's herbivorous, it's not a threat at all. It would be completely unknown to the blackbirds in Germany where the study was done. So the first step of the experiment was really to design a setup so they could control the exposure to each stimulus of the birds. So what they had was a demonstrator blackbird that would be mobbing. They had an observer blackbird, so this presumably had experience of mobbing, but not necessarily in this situation. And they had a chamber in between that could rotate. So they would start it with empty cages on the two sides facing the birds. And then they had the stuffed friar bird and the stuffed owl on the other side, and they could rotate it as they wanted. So they began with a curtain there so that the observer couldn't see the demonstrator. The observer is the one they were collecting data from. So first they moved the thing and showed the empty chamber to see how it would react to that. And then they, still keeping this curtain up so it couldn't see the demonstrator, then they showed it the friar bird and to see how it would react to that without any further information. And then this is the key to the experiment. Then they removed the curtain and set it up so that the demonstrator could see the owl, but the observer could see the friar bird, and the observer could see the demonstrator, and vice versa. So the demonstrator then started to mob the owl, but the observer couldn't see the owl and could only see the friar bird. And so the question is then, when you go to the next stage, put the curtain back, block off the demonstrator, and show the friar bird again, will this observer now treat the friar bird as if it's as dangerous as the owl, as if it's a threat? So here's what the data showed. So there was some response just when they moved the apparatus and had the empty chamber. And because different birds showed different strengths of reactions, they scaled everything to the level of the empty chamber. So this number one means the relative response. So it starts with the empty chamber. So that's one. So when they just show the friar bird, there's a bit of an increase. So it's about 1.5 times as much of a response. So there was some reaction to the friar bird itself. But when they removed the curtain and the demonstrator was mobbing the owl, the friar bird went, quotes, crazy, 3.5 times as much of a response. So it participated really strongly in that. And then when they blocked off the demonstrator again and showed the friar bird just by itself with no clues, then the response was still 3 times as much as it had been to the empty chamber, and much more than when the friar bird was shown the first time. So after this exposure, they essentially tricked the blackbird, the observer blackbird, into treating the friar bird as if it was dangerous. And so, but they had to have quite a few controls. One of the controls was to make sure that the just showing the friar bird 3 times in a row like that by itself didn't increase the response each time. So this is the empty chamber was the same, slight increase when the friar bird was shown, but it actually decreased to be less even than the empty chamber when they showed it the next 2 times. So it indicates quite strongly that that blackbirds can be tricked into adult blackbirds can be tricked into recognizing a non-threat as a genuine threat by seeing a conspecific engaged in mobbing. And perhaps even more interesting is that this information could be transmitted from one bird to another. So if you take that observer that now mobs the friar bird and put it in the position of the demonstrator and have a new bird seeing the friar bird, you can pass it on to the next one. They were able to do that 6 times from one to the other, so that they had that information essentially spreading in the population about that this Friarbird was a dangerous species, as one individual taught another. And then they said, well, if it works with a bird, is it something about a bird? So the next thing they did was to test it with an empty bottle, and an empty plastic bottle. And they even found they could have a similar effect to the Friarbird. So they would start to mob the empty bottle after that demonstration. So this indicates that target species can be learned from members of the same species. And this means that teaching and learning of dangerous species is another potential benefit of mobbing. But we really don't know if individuals can learn from other members of other species, as might take place in the chickadees. And we don't know if mobbing could sometimes not even particularly be functioning to get the predator to move on, but could function mainly as teaching. So if crows have their juveniles fledged and around, might they sometimes mob just so they can gather their young around and indicate what's a dangerous species? So mobbing has a number of potential and attempted applications. So one is that since mobbing by chickadees especially seems to attract so many other species, could playback of chickadee mobbing calls increase the total number of birds that are seen when you're doing point counts? And there have been a couple of studies that have tried that. And what turns out is that the total number of birds seen is actually higher in playing mobbing calls than in not playing calls. But when they divide it up by species, some species become much more detectable, but some species become less, and some it doesn't change. So more can be seen, but it might actually bias the counts in other ways. And mobbing has also been used to look at barriers to conductivity of habitat. So I think many of you are aware of the concept that roads and clear cuts might separate populations that aren't willing to cross larger open areas. So one study in Banff used that to look at both rivers versus small streams versus multi-lane highways versus small local roads to see which could be barriers to movement. So what they did was they played loud chickadee mobbing calls that gathered a group around them. In this case, I think it was still black-capped chickadees. And then they would move their speakers across the highway or across the road or across the river or the stream and play it again and see which was a barrier to the birds then moving on and mobbing at the new location. And they were able to get some insights into what things would be crossed and what wouldn't. And a similar approach has been used to look at recommended sizes of clear cuts that might affect forest birds in boreal forest logging. And I won't go into this in too much detail, but mobbing is now starting to be used more and more to actually understanding more, you want to say, esoteric or fine points of animal communication. So one whole area of animal behavior that's been developing quite strongly is to what extent do animals convey specific information in their calls or in their vocalization. So for a long time, it was thought that the calls of birds were just a kind of an emotional response and conveyed no information to other birds. But now we recognize that there can be functional reference. There can be information in those calls. So one part of that involves seeing whether mobbing calls given to different targets are actually different. So do they, if the predator is a more dangerous or a less dangerous one, if it's actually hunting versus if it's resting, do the calls actually vary? But of course the calls could vary, but the information might not be used. So then playback experiments are necessary to find out if the mobbing calls to different targets are actually responded to differently by other mobbers. And the great thing about acoustic measures is that it's much easier to manipulate the signal than it is with visual signals. And so it's possible then to leave some things out of the record or add some in and find out what are the actual components of the calls that convey that information. So there's quite a bit of that, and black-capped chickadees have played a large role in it, but are by no means the only species that's been studied. And once people started to think about mobbing, they realized it may apply to other species. So I haven't really mentioned, but there are studies of mammals that mob and even fish mobbing in some situations. And it's been suggested that barking in dogs and other canids like wolves and coyotes may be a form of mobbing. So although I don't think anyone would confuse a barking dog with a mobbing chickadee, there's quite similar acoustical structure in the broad sense between the kind of repeated barking of a dog and the cawing of a crow or the call of a chickadee. And Lord et al. In their study noted that the context is somewhat similar. So wild wolves and coyotes typically issue their bark when a person gets too close to a den site. So it's the situation where they are kind of held to that site by defending the young, but tempted to flee because a human is close. And that's somewhat similar to the situation for mobbing, where there's a predator, so there's some motivation of the prey to flee, but on the other hand, either they're young or at risk, or they're at risk, or there's a benefit of potentially driving the predator away. So they're also motivated to stay. So that kind of conflict. And if you think about a dog, even though their context of barking can be very different, the fact that the dog is often on its home territory, but might in some way be frightened or tempted to leave or get away, but also stay and defend that territory, suggests that it might be similar. I don't think the study was by any means conclusive, but it's interesting to think about the way that a different concept can be applied in situations where you don't originally think about it. And an even more different concept, perhaps, is that it's been also applied to workplace harassment, especially in Europe. Some of the legislation actually refers to mobbing. And this came from a social psychologist who read Konrad Lorenz's famous book on aggression, and the section in which he actually describes mobbing as attack in terms of aggression directed at other species, and realized that there was some similarity to large-scale harassment in workplaces, and applied the term. So when you start looking up references to mobbing behavior, don't be surprised if you find books on workplace mobbing in Italy and so on. Okay, and then finally, or almost finally, for us birders, there's a question about whether pishing mimics a chickadee or a titmouse mobbing call. So pishing is this psh, 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 psh noise that birders sometimes make to induce a bird that's hidden in the bushes to kind of so-called pop out, to jump up, see what's happening, and so the observer can get a better look at it. And although the sounds don't sound the same, so here's a black-capped chickadee mobbing a broad-shouldered hawk. So I'm gonna stop it there because that annoying buzz in there, I don't know what that was. But in chickadees, the number or the pattern of the D calls is often, the DDD is often associated with the actual risk. That's one of the things that have been studied. And so it's been argued that pishing has acoustical similarities to that call, and that it may be, and that may be what attracts the birds to pishing. And so there have been a few studies comparing responses to recorded pishing to to the calls of chickadees and titmice. And but there's some geographical evidence as well, and that is that a number of observers have noticed that fishing doesn't work as well in the tropics, except with northern birds that are there temporarily. So in areas where birds don't have experience of chickadees or titmice, in general, fishing doesn't seem to work as well. And one study in Northern California where the oak titmouse was the only member of the chickadee and titmouse family, compared responses to fishing, to titmice mobbing calls, and to North American chickadees and European tits, and found very little difference between them. So considered it supportive that fishing is actually a mobbing attraction type stimulus. And now this may or may not show up here. I won't let it go on too long, but I'll put the link to it. It's a very dramatic example of fishing. And Anne, if this is just not showing at all, you can unmute yourself and let me know. And I'll put the link in the comments so that you can see it anyway. It's worth a look for those birders in the group. So it was done in the East. It was someone fishing in a context of fall migration of warblers. And it's quite amazing.
These are all migrating warblers heading to Central America. Pine warbler, Tennessee warbler, black and white warbler, Parula warbler, yellow rump warbler, myrtle warbler, magnolia, there's a downy woodpecker, chickadees.
So I'll continue. I'll put the link in it. It's worth a look for those that have done it. It's certainly not anything that I've ever been able to elicit, but it does raise the issue that there may be ethical implications of using fishing. So if it's a mobbing call, it may be eliciting anti-predator behavior, and that may result in time and energy and stress and maybe even habitat selection or failing to pay attention to a real predator. And so it is an indication that we should be careful and not use fishing to an excess. And the final application is that it can be even applied in art. So this is a drawing that we obtained a while ago from TV Cape Dorset Inuit artist that to my eyes and Vanessa's as well, I think indicates a mobbing interaction between a raven and a snowy owl. So in conclusion, mobbing is widespread behavior. It's likely to be somewhat dangerous. It likely provides benefits by inducing predators to avoid the area and by teaching young which predators are dangerous. When used with care, mobbing calls can help us understand bird ecology, but our understanding is still incomplete. Birders can help fill out that incomplete picture, and it's useful to put the behavioral context in your comments on eBird. And if you see something really unique, like a capture of a mob bird, to consider publishing a note of those observations. So I think I'll go out of sharing the screen and open it up for questions and let Anne